Hi, it's Lee from Colouring Queen, and today I'm going to do something a little different with this colouring page from Maria Troll's book, Flora. I've decided to try out Pointillism. Now, if you've never heard of it, Pointillism is this super cool art technique where you use just dots or sometimes short little strokes to build up your whole picture. Now, it's been around since the days of the post-impressionists. So we're talking late 1800s, and it's mostly famously used by artists like George Seurat and Paul Signac. If you've seen Seurat's Sunday Afternoon, that's basically the poster child for pointillism. Now, those artists would usually start with something called an underpainting. Just basically means that they paint a base color on canvas first and then layer their dots on top or their short strokes. And it actually gives the finished piece a lot more depth than just putting dots straight onto a blank canvas. Now, I'm doing the underpainting with Inktense pencils, and so I'm just going to very quickly uh, put the color down where I see and just do a watercolor over it. Now, back in the post-impressionist era, artists mainly stuck to the primary colors, so red, blue, yellow, and then black and white. And they were really clever about how colors work together, especially when you look at the painting from a distance. All those little dots of pure color would kind of blend together in your eyes. So you'd see all these new colors that weren't actually painted, they weren't actually colors. It's kind of like magic. They use this trick to make their paintings look super vibrant and full of life, even though they're just using dots and small dashes or short strokes. So now you might have heard people talk about pointillism when they're actually doing something that's called stippling. Stippling was invented by Giulio Campanolo in 1510, and he was an engraver, and he found that instead of using hatching for engraving, using smaller dots would actually allow a smoother transition. So stippling is usually done with pen or ink, and you use just one color. And the idea is if you put a lot of dots close together, it looks darker. So the spot where you have a lot of shadow or shading would have a lot of close dots together, and if you space the dots out, it looks lighter. So think about it like when you're blending out with pencils from dark to light. So you can basically create shading and highlights just by changing the spacing of how close or how far away your dots are. So it's a really cool way to get depth and texture, even with just one color. So a lot of things have changed over the era because we've got new things now. So people tend to miss and match the two terms. So just to clear things up, pointillism is all about using colored dots, usually with paint, to create color blends and illusions. Or stippling is more about using a single color like black ink, but it's great in colors as well, to create shading and form. And both are great in different ways. Both use dots, but they're a little different in the technique, the mediums, and what they look like traditionally. Now, of course, nowadays we have so many art products and tools that in the olden days, these products weren't even around. They weren't invented. So now we can experiment with all sorts of mediums to get the look that we want. Anyway, I'm super excited to see how this experiment turns out. So as I color these dots or spots or circles, I want to tell you a story about dots. And you know how I like my stories to match with what I'm coloring. Now, if you've ever seen Aboriginal art from Australia, you'd probably be familiar with dots. Aboriginal paintings are often made up of thousands of dots, whether they're large, they're small, or even tiny dots. They could be arranged in swirling patterns and shapes. But here's a fun fact. They're not just a dot on a canvas. Every dot can tell a story. Aboriginal dot paintings aren't just beautiful to look at as a visual medium. They're actually a way of reporting history and mapping the land and sharing sacred stories. The art and the dots actually have a meaning to the culture. They're not just a representation of a spear on the canvas. The dots can be seen as artifacts and ancient rock paintings, as well as on body painting and sand paintings that's carried out for special ceremonies. Some dots represent waterholes, others are animal tracks, and some are even stars in the night sky. The style that we know today really took off in the 1970s in a place called Papunya in the Australian desert. The use of dots was not new to Aboriginal culture, but being used on canvas was actually introduced by a white art school teacher called Jeffrey Barden. Jeffrey had taken an art teacher job at Papunya, and he's actually credited with encouraging his students to transform their sand paintings to canvas, and later the seniors in the community to transfer the dreaming stories to murals and canvas. And artists there started using acrylic paints and canvas, and they're inspired by ancient rock art and, of course, sand drawings. But there was a twist. They used the dots to actually hide sacred symbols and stories, so the outsiders or the uninitiated couldn't actually see the full meaning. So it's like a secret code hidden in plain sight. So the dots are a way to camouflage basically sacred knowledge. So that's pretty clever. Now, by the way, I have loved Aboriginal art since I first set eyes on it, but I am certainly no expert and I don't know the stories attached to the dots. I'm in the camp of, wow, that's beautiful. I'd love to look at that all day. And just mentioning that in case anyone wants me to explain in detail about the designs, I don't know. Before I go further, I would also like to state for any Aboriginal viewers that there may be reference to Aboriginals who have since passed when you are watching or listening to this video. Now, back to our dot story. Fast forward a few decades and Aboriginal dot paintings are suddenly everywhere. Galleries in Sydney, New York, London, everyone wants a piece of Aboriginal art. And that's where the trouble starts. Because when something becomes valuable, people start to copy it. And that's not always flattering and it's not always in a good way. Imagine you're an artist and you pour your heart, your soul into your work. And then you see your designs. But they're more than designs, they're your stories being copied and sold on t-shirts, mugs, and yes, even carpets. And you don't get a cent. Worse, sometimes the people copying your work don't even know what it means. They don't understand the symbolism of it, and they don't understand the culture and the meaning. They just see a cool pattern, a trend, and a dollar sign. Now, here's another fact. The world's most expensive Aboriginal painting, War Lagunglong by Clifford Possum, sold for over 2.4 million Australian dollars back in 2007. Now that's a lot of dots and a lot of value. A few months earlier, a painting by Emily Kame, Earth's Creation 1, also achieved a record price of 2.1 million, making it the most valuable painting ever sold by an Australian female artist. And I've put the full Aboriginal names below the video because I really am having trouble pronouncing them. So now we have a bit of background. Let's get to the story of the carpets case. In the early 1990s, a company in Perth, which is in Western Australia, started importing carpets that they had ordered and were created in Vietnam. Now, these were woolen carpets, but they featured Aboriginal designs. They weren't just inspired by Aboriginal art, they were actually direct copies of paintings by well-known Indigenous artists or a substantial part of that painting. Now, the carpets were shipped to Australia and they were sold in shops with no credit or even payment to the original artists. And get this, the infringing carpets actually featured direct copies of 8 different Aboriginal artists' work. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not fair, that's a breach of copyright. But it gets a little bit tricky. At the time, there weren't many legal protections for Indigenous art. Hard to believe, but if you know anything about Aboriginal history in Australia, it's not as hard to believe as you might think. Copyright law exists, but it didn't always cover traditional designs or what's known as communal stories, things like the dreaming. Plus, many Aboriginal artists lived in remote communities. They didn't have access to lawyers, and they might not even know that their work had been copied. But this time, the artists did discover it and they decided to fight back. Now, a group of artists, and I'll put their name below the video because I do struggle with the pronunciation. A group of artists, including Banduk Marika, George Milpurrurru, and Tin Payungka, and representatives of the estates of 5 deceased artists, which I will not name out of respect for the Aboriginal culture. They were represented by Aboriginal legal aid, basically, and they took the carpet importers to court. Now, one of the paintings, called Goose Egg Hunt, was actually owned by the Australian National Gallery, and it was also featured on the 85-cent stamp back in 1993. All of these paintings were well known, they were recognisable, they were featured in galleries, universities, museums. The paintings had actually been reproduced and appeared on a stamp that I told you about by agreement. The artists were paid royalties from that. The artists had actually allowed their works to be reproduced in certain books and galleries, but it was always for an educational purpose to help people understand Aboriginal culture. Now, they never agreed to have their art used for commercial products like carpets, and especially not for profit. Their argument was simple. These designs were their intellectual property, had created them, and they deserved to be recognised and paid. Now, the case went to the Federal Court of Australia in 1994, and it was a big deal, not just for the artists, but for Indigenous communities all over the country. For the first time, the court had to decide, do Aboriginal artists actually have the same rights as everyone else? Can their stories and designs be protected by law? Now, the trial was intense. The artists explained the meaning behind their paintings, how each dot, each circle was part of a bigger story. They talked about the dream time, their ancestral stories that connect people to the land, and they gave evidence on the importance of Aboriginal laws and customs in relation to the stories incorporated in the paintings. Now, the Aboriginal law and customs on who could actually create the paintings and tell the stories and the terms on which they could do so was also something that they gave evidence on. Now, this is very much a collective type of decision making among the Aboriginal group. Now, the artists and their legal team, they made several key arguments. The first being copyright infringement. And this was their main legal argument, that the carpets were direct copies of their original artworks, and this was a clear breach of copyright law. Now, the Copyright Act basically protects original artistic works, and the court agreed that these paintings and designs qualified for that. They also claimed cultural harm. The artists explained that under Aboriginal law, using these designs without permission could cause real harm, not just to the artist, but to their whole community. In the past, breaking these rules could actually lead to severe punishments, even death. Now, under Aboriginal law, if someone reproduces a story or image without consent, it's their responsibility as traditional owners to take action to preserve the dreaming and punish those that have offended. Now, these punishments differ from the Australian legal justice system, which in some cases, the Aboriginal form of punishment would be putting someone to death. They could be outcast, they could be speared, or the providing of payment of money. Now, today it could mean being shunned or losing the right to create art or being excluded from ceremonies, all of which have a huge impact. The artists also claimed personal distress and for the embarrassment that they felt. For example, Miss Marika, one of the artists, said that if her family found out her sacred story had been put on a carpet, she could be outcast or banned from making art in the future. They also argued that the art was actually a communal ownership. In their culture, these stories and designs aren't owned by an individual, but they're owned by the whole community. And so the harm done by copying the design of one was felt by everyone, not just the copyright holder. Now, Indofurn, which was the carpet company, they tried to defend themselves in a few ways. First of all, they denied any infringement. They said they didn't feel that they'd done anything that was illegal. Even after being warned by the Aboriginal Legal Service and the Aboriginal Arts Management Association, they actually continued to import and sell the carpets. They also questioned whether the artists really owned the copyright or whether the Aboriginal Arts Management Association was acting in the artist's best interest. Now, the court found these arguments to be baseless and even called their tactics extraordinary. Now, the company also tried to argue that the carpets were just commercial products and that the artists hadn't really lost any money because their works were already being used in books and galleries. Now, as I explained earlier, those works were being used with consent and they were being used to educate people on the Australian Aboriginal culture. Now, the court actually went and visited the communities and they actually listened to the artists explain their work. They actually went on site and actually had a little trip out. It wasn't just about the legal arguments in this matter. It was actually about understanding the culture, the tradition, and the meaning behind the art. And the court did the same for one of the most famous Australian cases, which is Mabo. They went and actually visited the community so they could see what it was all about. Now, the court actually looked at all the evidence and they made several really important findings. First of all, they found that there was a clear copyright breach. They found that the carpets were almost exact copies of the original artworks. They also found that there was cultural and personal harm. They recognised that the harm done wasn't just about money, that the misuse of these designs could cause real distress and even social consequences for the artists in their communities. Now, they awarded damages to the artists, not just for the lost money, but also to recognise that cultural harm and the disrespect shown by the company. The living artists got a larger share, while the estates of the deceased artists also received compensation, though the law didn't fully recognise the communal ownership that's so important in Aboriginal culture. The judge said that the company's actions were plainly deliberate and calculated, and they'd been warned multiple times but ignored all advice and kept going. And this led to extra damages being awarded as a kind of punishment for doing that. Now, the case was a big step in recognising that Aboriginal art isn't just decoration, it's a living part of culture and law, and copying it without permission can have some serious consequences. But the court also pointed out that Australian copyright law still has a long way to go in fully protecting Aboriginal cultural heritage, especially for really old designs where it's hard to say who the original artist was. And the judge even suggested that Australia might need some new laws, special laws, just for protecting Aboriginal folklore and communal rights, because the current copyright system doesn't always fit the way Aboriginal culture works. Now, the case set a precedent, not just in Australia, but around the world. It showed that Indigenous art is valuable and that artists have the right to control how their work is used. And if you want to read the actual legal Now,
judgment, I'll
damages
link it
were
below as I
awarded
always
to the
do.
group of over $188,000. But if you think that the artists got to benefit from that, you would be wrong because the company promptly went broke and was wound up and no damages were paid. But the principle of the matter, I guess, is still there, but no actual money changed hands. But the case still matters, even though they didn't get paid, which is really sad. Every time you see a dot painting or when you're looking at it, just think about it that you're not just looking at a pretty painting. you're actually seeing a story, and it's a piece of culture and a hard-won victory for artists' rights. So that carpet's case, it actually helped pave the way for better laws and more respect and fairer treatment for Indigenous artists. But the fight isn't over for them. Even today, there are still cases of fake art, style theft, and exploitation. And that's why it's really important to buy Aboriginal art from ethical sources and support community art centres. There's
and
actually a
give
voluntary
credit where
code
it's
of
due.
conduct in Australia called the Indigenous Art Code, and it helps buyers actually identify ethical sellers and ensure artists are treated fairly. So if you're ever thinking of buying Aboriginal art, make sure that you look up and see if they are a member of that. Here's some other little fun facts about the art paintings. The dots aren't all the same. Different regions use different dotting techniques and colours. So Western Desert artists are famous for their bright, dense dotting, while other regions might use larger dots or they might combine them with cross-hatching, as you might see in bark paintings. And it's just a living tradition that's still going on. It's actually even been used in protests and rallies to raise awareness of Indigenous land rights and also the Aboriginal culture. So new generations of artists are still incorporating dots into their paintings and even collaborating with stores in Australia like Bunnings and Kmart to produce things which I never thought we would see in my lifetime. So as I finish up colouring these dots, I hope you think about the stories behind the art and about the carpet case, that it's just one chapter in a much bigger story. And next time you see a dot painting, remember the artists who fought to protect their culture and the power for standing up for what's right for them. Now, the links are in the description to the sources, and if you're ever in Australia, visit a local art centre and you'll be able to see some of that beautiful. Unfortunately, my dots aren't as great and as wonderful as those in the Aboriginal art world. And I finished my picture offline and I ended up having a splatter accident and spilling some Posca on my white dots. So as many of you know already, don't shake your Posca pen over your work, because mine turned into a splatter rather than pointillism, and I've had to try and fix it up. So instead of being dots, it was splatter. Anyway, I decided to do a chalk background because the thought of doing a million dots had me spiraling. So it probably wasn't the best picture to try this on from this book, but it was fun and it was a bit easier to do on my injuries and usual colouring. So anyway, that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.